Hey guys! Tonight we drift into one of the strangest corners of medieval royalty, the part they definitely don't put in the glossy museum brochures. You're standing in a flickering candlelit hall, and every time someone introduces themselves, you can't shake the feeling you've heard that name before. And you have. Because everyone here is related to everyone else, often much more closely than you'd expect. You're stepping into a world where queens are sisters by blood, cousins by marriage, and occasionally both at the same time. A world where matchmaking wasn't about romance but about preserving power, and you, if you happened to be born into this mess, would probably not survive the family dinners, let alone the politics. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun seeing this sleepy little community spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open a heavy wooden door, entering a quiet corridor of time where your footsteps echo against stone. And as you glide deeper into the dimness, you find yourself stepping into the shared world of two royal sisters. Women born to one crown but destined for different, equally tangled, equally exhausting thrones. Their names change depending on which dynasty you prefer. Plantagenets, Capetians, Aragonese, but the pattern stays eerily consistent. Picture two daughters of a powerful medieval king. From childhood, they're told they'll be queens someday. No big surprise. But the part whispered afterward, the part that makes you raise an eyebrow, is this. You'll marry your cousin. Both of you will. Different cousins, same strategy. Because keeping land, titles, and influence in the family wasn't just a preference. It was the operating system of medieval politics. You walk beside them as they grow, one a little more rebellious, one a little more obedient, both raised with the kind of strict etiquette that makes your modern brain itch. Their tutors drone on about courtly manners, the roles of queenship, and the importance of alliance. You can almost hear the unspoken footnote. And by alliance, we mean marriage. And by marriage, we mean you don't get to choose. A mainstream historical fact here, across medieval Europe, over half of noble marriages were between close relatives, especially first and second cousins. It wasn't an accident. It was policy. Royal sisters were essentially diplomatic multipliers, two matching chess pieces placed strategically on different corners of the same board. But here's the quirky tidbit. Sometimes these sisters ended up in nearly identical marriages, not just by design, but by sheer genealogical chaos. One might become Queen of France, married to a cousin through her mother's line. The other becomes Queen of Scotland, married to a cousin through her father's. And because the same families intermarried for generations, you eventually get queens who are cousins twice. A genealogist's nightmare, a medieval gossip columnist's dream. You watch one sister ride toward her new kingdom, wrapped in silk, looking every bit the ideal bride, while secretly, and very understandably, terrified. Her cousin husband waits for her in a great hall, about as excited as a man who's marrying a person he last saw when they were both toddlers could possibly be. Medieval romance vibes, 0. Political necessity, maximum. The other sister doesn't fare much better. Her own cousin king is polite enough, but weddings like these had about as much spontaneity as a tax audit. Historians still argue whether these tightly orchestrated unions strengthened kingdoms or slowly destabilized them by concentrating too much shared blood into too few heirs. It's a debate that continues today, especially when tracing the repeating patterns of illness in later dynasties. And as you drift alongside these two young queens, you feel the tension that never leaves them. Every child they bear isn't just a baby, it's a potential successor, a bargaining chip, a shield against rival claims. Siblings in ordinary life might share secrets or clothes. Royal sisters shared geopolitical responsibilities and the ever-present weight of dynastic expectation. Sometimes they wrote to each other, letters filled with carefully phrased encouragement, political updates, and the occasional remark about how exhausting court life could be. And yes, medieval queens absolutely complained about their husbands just politely, in code, and always knowing someone else might be reading. You catch snippets. One sister gently hinting that her king cousin is stubborn, another implying her cousin king is always listening to the wrong advisors. Neither, You can say the obvious. We were born to powerful families, and yet have so little control over our own lives. And through it all, the courts whisper about their closeness, two queens linked not only by blood, but by shared fate, shared obligations, shared frustration, and occasionally shared enemies. Their worlds move in parallel lines, mirroring each other in ways both beautiful and suffocating. You glide through their intertwined stories, realizing that their marriages weren't isolated oddities. They were part of a wider pattern shaping the fates of Europe's most powerful families. The closer the blood, the tighter the political leash. And for these sisters, those ties bound them across kingdoms, across decades, and across the unfolding chessboard of medieval power. Their lives mark the beginning of your journey into the world of Europe's most closely related royal women. Women whose family trees don't branch so much as spiral. You follow the candle glow as it stretches down a long, cold hallway, and the air shifts slightly heavier, slightly more secretive. You're moving from the Sister Queen corridors into something a little more uncomfortable, the kind of family arrangement that makes you pause mid-step and whisper, "Wait, what now?" Because tonight, you drift straight into the world of Aunt Niece royal alliances, marriages where a king looked across his own family tree, pointed at a branch that was way too close, and said, "Yes, that one. Perfect." You slide into a grand medieval audience chamber where a powerful king sits under heavy banners. He's older, stately, respected, weighed down by politics, and his council is buzzing around him like stressed bees. He needs an heir. He needs allies. He needs stability. And annoyingly, the best candidate by his diplomatic logic happens to be his niece. You can practically feel modern geneticists clutching their clipboards. Mainstream fact. European dynasties routinely used uncle-niece marriages to tie families together. The Capetians, Trastamaras, and Habsburgs all dipped into that gene pool more than once. To them, it wasn't taboo, it was strategy. Marrying within the family kept titles from drifting into rival hands, prevented messy inheritance disputes, and simplified alliances. You keep everything neat and tidy, like an aristocratic sock drawer. Except the socks are people. And then there's the niece. Picture her. Young, polished, trained from birth to be decorative, diplomatic, and dutiful. She's been raised hearing that marriage is destiny, duty, and divine order. But no one told her the groom might be the same uncle who gave her carved toys when she was 5. Try bringing that up during wedding planning. You watch the council debate. Some advisors shift uncomfortably. Others nod as though this is perfectly reasonable Tuesday business. Historians still argue whether these marriages were driven by genuine political desperation or by an almost superstitious belief in the purity of family bloodlines. Either way, the niece's fate is sealed long before anyone bothers to ask her opinion. And here comes your quirky tidbit. In several courts, the wedding preparations for these unions included special omens readings to see if God approved. Because apparently the Almighty was expected to issue a thumbs up or thumbs down on an uncle marrying his sister's daughter. Medieval theology, undefeated champion of eyebrow-lifting contradictions. You drift closer as the girl is summoned. She glides into the hall, all careful posture and controlled breathing, the teenage equivalent of bracing yourself before hitting join meeting on a call you've been dreading. Her uncle smiles gently, because in many cases, these weren't villainous men. They were simply acting within the political logic of their time. Gross logic, sure, but logic nonetheless. The wedding is arranged swiftly. Royal scribes draft documents with the 5, enthusiasm of people who've done this way too often. A papal dispensation arrives because even the church had to step in and say, "All right, fine, but only because you're royalty." You can almost see the parchment smirking. When the ceremony arrives, you walk with her down the aisle. The church is cold, the candles crackle, and the air smells faintly of incense and nerves. Her uncle-husband waits at the altar, wearing robes that shimmer in the half-light. And every noblewoman in the pews is thinking the same silent thought. There, but for the grace of family politics, go I. As the vows are spoken, you sense a strange unease even in the most hardened courtiers. This isn't sister-cousin marriage territory anymore. This is closer, sharper. The family tree is beginning to curl back on itself. And yet, despite everything, some of these pairings were politically explosive in the best way. A union like this could end wars, reinforce alliances, or unify kingdoms, and the niece queens, once settled into their roles, wielded quiet power, not because of romance, but because their birth gave them instant authority. They were simultaneously family and royalty, blood and crown. In medieval terms, that was a cheat code. You follow one particular niece queen as she enters her new life. Court ladies teach her how to project serenity during feasts, how to glide instead of walk, and how to smile even when the court gossip grows loud. She learns to play politics like a chess game she never asked to join, and every now and then she drafts a secret letter to her mother, who is now also her mother-in-law. Medieval family reunions must have been interesting. She survives, she adapts, she becomes queen not through love, but through resilience. And her children? Well, they become some of the most interconnected royals Europe ever produced. Their family tree looks less like branches and more like loops, spirals, and doodles someone sketched in a bored moment. And you drift out of her world with one final realization. To medieval royalty, closeness of blood wasn't a red flag. It was a seal of legitimacy. The closer, the better. The more intertwined, the stronger the dynasty. At least, in theory. You drift deeper into the dimly lit passages of medieval Europe, and the walls around you start to feel tighter, not physically, but genealogically, because now you're stepping into the realm of double first cousins, a situation where two siblings from one family married two siblings from another family, and their children ended up related on both sides. It's like someone took the family tree, folded it in half, and said, "Yes, that'll do nicely." You walk into a warm, tapestried chamber where two royal sisters sit side by side, both embroidering something overly complicated. Lions, lilies, dragons, creatures that scream, "I have way too much free time." Across the room, two brothers, princes, ambitious, and equally coiffed, study maps of their future lands. And you watch as politics gently pushes all four of them toward a destiny that feels more like an arranged square dance than romance. Mainstream fact, double first cousin marriages happened more often than people realize, especially when two powerful houses wanted to lock themselves together with something stronger than a single union. The Capetians and Aragonese did it. The Trastamras did it. The Navarrese did it. It was the medieval equivalent of making sure your Wi-Fi had backup cables, redundancy equals stability. But here comes the quirky twist. Children produced from double first cousin marriages shared the same amount of genetic similarity as the offspring of siblings. Yep, you heard that right. These weren't just cousins. They were super cousins, mega cousins, the deluxe collector's edition of cousins. You follow one of these daughters born to parents who were both sets of siblings, and her life feels uncannily predetermined. From infancy, she's surrounded by familiar faces. Because literally everyone is family. Her governess? Cousin. Her future husband? Cousin. Her political allies? Cousins. Her political rivals? Also cousins. Imagine trying to build an identity in a world where every introduction feels like déjà vu. Historians still argue whether these unions were intentional long-term genetic strategies or just the byproduct of extremely small aristocratic dating pools. Was it deliberate dynasty tightening, or were medieval nobles simply running out of people who weren't related? The debate is ongoing, and the genealogical charts are messy enough to fuel a decade of academic arguments. You glide into a feast celebrating one such marriage. Two young lovers. Okay, lovers is generous. Politically compatible teenagers is closer. Join hands as musicians play lutes in the background. The sisters-in-law become double sisters-in-law. The brothers-in-law become double brothers-in-law. The family herald considers whether to add extra loops to the family crest to represent the new genetic figure eight they've created. Meanwhile, the daughter at the center of this section grows into a young woman with the quiet certainty that her fate is sealed. She's groomed for queenship, yes, but the path is so narrow it feels like walking a balance beam over a moat of political crocodiles. You hover beside her as she learns diplomacy, dance steps, court etiquette, and the subtle art of smiling just the right amount while being discussed like a trade agreement. And then you watch as she's married off to a man who is both her first cousin and, because these things happen, also connected to her through the other parental pairing. They share not just grandparents, but all four of them. Her wedding feels oddly like a family reunion, where someone accidentally brought a priest. The ceremony itself is warm enough, with incense curling upward and stained glass light flickering across stone floors. But there's an undeniable undercurrent. Everyone here knows this is not about love. It's about consolidation, about merging claims, about creating heirs whose bloodlines are proof of unbreakable unity. And yet the couple tries. They walk the gardens. They exchange awkward jokes about their shared childhood memories. At one point, you hear the groom say, "Remember when we used to steal figs from the orchard?" She laughs softly because, yes, she does remember. They were 5. This entire marriage feels like a continuation of a game they never stopped playing. But beneath the surface, tension thrums. Court whisperers murmur about the dangers of too much sameness. Midwives fuss nervously over the health of future infants. And scholars long after will trace the ripple effects of these unions through the centuries, noticing patterns in royal health, temperament, and politics. Still, the woman at the center lives her life with grace. She bears children, manages estates, advises her cousin husband, and navigates court intrigue with surprising steadiness. You float beside her as she writes letters always to relatives, because who else is there? And records details about family connections that make your modern brain desperately want a spreadsheet. In her quieter moments, she gazes out of arched palace windows and wonders whether her children will one day marry their cousins in equally convoluted ways. Spoiler, they will. And as you drift away from her world, you realize that medieval royalty didn't just marry within the family. They folded entire branches together, tying knots so tight that later dynasties, especially one notorious house we'll get to soon, would spend generations unraveling the consequences. Double first cousins were just the beginning of the spiral. You drift forward, deeper into the corridor of monarchs and their endlessly looping pedigrees, and the air grows unmistakably Austrian, thick with incense, velvet, and a touch of, "We definitely took this too far." Because now you're stepping fully into the young roots of the most infamous genealogical labyrinth in European history. The early Habsburg web, a place where royal women weren't born into branches of a family tree, but into circles. You emerge into a vaulted hall overlooking alpine valleys, where banners of red and white hang perfectly symmetrical fitting, because symmetry is basically the Habsburg love language. You watch as a young archduchess, one of the earliest women in the line, moves through the hall like she already knows the shape of her future. Confined, glittering, politically essential, and genealogically compact. Mainstream fact: the Habsburgs became notorious for centuries of close-kin marriages, but the pattern didn't begin in the 1500s. The earliest generations were already looping themselves together, using cousine marriages to bind Austrian, Swabian, and Burgundian claims into one unstoppable mega-dynasty. By the time later inbreeding was noticeable, the foundation had already been poured. But here's your quirky tidbit. Early Habsburg matchmakers were so obsessed with keeping it in the family that they sometimes drew proposed marriage charts years before the prospective bride was born. Medieval planners had audacity, if nothing else. You follow our early Habsburg archduchess, let's call her Anna for clarity, as you drift beside her, because Anna is the kind of woman whose bloodline would later ripple into some very famous faces and chins. She's raised in a stone castle perched on a craggy mountainside, where winters bite hard and political ambition burns even harder. And from an early age, she's told something unusual. Your husband will be family. Count on it. Not might be, not possibly, but will be. As in, this is the Habsburg starter pack. Her father, a calculating lord with an impressive cloak and a slightly alarming smile, studies maps every night. You hover behind him as he traces a finger along cousine-held territories, mumbling things like, "Yes, if my daughter marries his son, then their son marries her cousin, then their daughter marries that cousin." It's like watching someone try to solve a Rubik's Cube by shoving pieces together until they stick. Historians still argue whether the early Habsburgs believed they were strengthening divine lineage, or if they were simply paranoid about losing territory. Both theories have merit, and both are discussed with the kind of academic intensity usually reserved for ancient mysteries or badly written TV finales. Eventually the marriage comes. Anna, now 16, and trained to hold herself like a porcelain statue, is presented with her groom, a first cousin who, in truly medieval fashion, she met once, years ago while stealing pastries from the castle kitchen. He remembers the pastries. She remembers that he cried when a goat sneezed near him. Romantic foundations, unpromising. Yet the wedding proceeds with immaculate pomp. Trumpets, flowers, incense so thick you could carve your initials into it. The bishop drones through the ceremony with a glazed look, as though he's officiating the 17th cousine marriage this month, which, honestly, he might be. You follow Anna through the early years of her queenship. She adjusts to the rhythm of court life, endless banquets, diplomatic letters written with the elegance of a woman who absolutely knows where her family tree overlaps with her husband's. Spoiler: almost everywhere. But beneath the velvet and feasts, you sense something else, a creeping pattern, subtle but present. Each generation tugs the Habsburg gene pool a little tighter, a little closer. And Anna, without realizing it, is helping weave the first threads of a genetically compact dynasty that will dominate European politics for centuries. As she bears children, some lively, some sickly, you notice a pattern in the midwife's whispers. Too much resemblance, too much sameness. They don't have the vocabulary of heredity yet, but they know something feels off. They know the family web is tightening. And here's where your historian brain kicks in. The famous Habsburg jaw isn't visible yet. It won't be for generations, but you can sense the prelude. The women of this early era, Anna and her cousins, carry the seeds of traits that future Habsburgs will bear in exaggerated, unmistakable form. Fate moves slowly, but it moves. Anna writes letters to her sisters, who are also marrying cousins in nearby courts, forming a network of alliances so tangled it makes your brain feel like it needs an oil change. One sister complains about politics, another complains about her husband's obsession with falconry. A third casually mentions, "By the way, we're related through both parents now," which is a very Habsburg thing to say. Through these letters, you glimpse the earliest shape of a dynasty that will soon swallow Burgundy, Spain, Austria, Bohemia, and half of Italy. And all because of marriages like these quiet, calculated, genealogically questionable unions that created unstoppable political blocs. You drift with Anna one last time as she stands on a balcony overlooking the Alps. She's young, but already weary. She knows her children will one day carry this dynasty forward. She knows they'll marry cousins too. It's not a question. It's not a debate. It's simply how things are done. You step back, letting the chill mountain wind brush against you, as the early Habsburg web begins its centuries-long tightening, ready to reshape Europe through the lives of women born into spirals rather than branches. You move forward through the dim corridors of medieval inheritance, and the walls around you feel heavier, like they're carrying the weight of choices made long before any of the women you're about to meet were even born. Because now you step into a world where some royal girls enter life with their futures already sealed in ink. Their tutors whisper it. Their mothers avoid the topic. Their fathers casually mention it while carving roast pheasant. These are the queens raised from childhood to marry their own uncles. You pass through a chamber lined with tapestries bright but stiff, all knights and saints and extremely judgmental angels, and you find a small girl sitting at a long wooden table. She's no more than 6, her feet swinging, a wax tablet in front of her. She's practicing her pen strokes, and as you drift closer, you hear her governess say something that makes even your modern spine stiffen. One day, your husband will be a great king, and you already know him. The girl frowns, puzzled, because the only king she knows is Uncle Richard, or Uncle Alfonso, or Uncle Charles, depending on the dynasty we're drifting through tonight. But you already know where this is heading. Medieval royal politics didn't care about emotional discomfort. It cared about borders, claims, and the smooth, unbroken transfer of power. If a man had no son, but his brother had a daughter, well, problem solved. Just marry the girl to the uncle, and keep the crown inside the tightest genetic circle possible. A mainstream fact. Uncle-niece marriages existed across multiple European dynasties, and not as the shocking anomalies we'd assume today. The Trastámaras of Castile, the Braganzas of Portugal, and several branches of the Capetians all embraced the tactic. To them, it wasn't scandal, it was efficiency. But here's your quirky tidbit. In some courts, young girls were raised with role-specific training for marrying an uncle. Their education emphasized emotional composure, absolute obedience, and the peculiar art of addressing your future spouse with both regal formality and childhood familiarity. One manual even advised, treat him as king in public and as kin in private. Imagine the mental gymnastics involved. You walk beside one such girl, let's call her Isabella, because half of medieval Iberia seems to be named Isabella anyway. She grows up in a palace where every corridor echoes with political planning disguised as family life. Her uncle visits often, not out of affection but out of expectation. He smiles gently, praises her embroidery, and evaluates quietly, methodically, whether she will be a suitable queen. Historians still argue whether these girls understood what was happening or simply absorbed it the way children absorb odd household rules. Some scholars think they were fully aware, others argue that royal upbringing was so saturated with duty that love and discomfort blurred into the same quiet resignation. When Isabella turns 12, things start moving quickly. Ambassadors whisper, priests draft dispensation requests to Rome because yes, even the medieval church looked at uncle-niece marriage and said, okay, but you need a permission slip. Popes often granted it, though sometimes with surprisingly dramatic commentary. One pope warned that such unions could invite divine displeasure, which is medieval speak for, I'm stamping this, but I don't love it. You stand beside Isabella as she's dressed for her proxy betrothal ceremony. The women brushing her hair talk in soft, respectful tones, but occasionally their eyes flicker with pity. They've seen this before. They know girls raised for these unions grow up quickly. Their childhoods shorten like a candle burning at both ends. The wedding itself, days or weeks later, is a masterpiece of spectacle. Cathedrals shimmer with candlelight, choirs echo through stone arches, courtiers dress like they're competing in some medieval Met Gala. And at the center of it all, Isabella stands beside her uncle-husband, trying to look serene while every instinct in her modern viewer, a.k.a. you screams, this is not ideal. Yet to the people around her, this marriage represents stability. It prevents rival families from claiming the throne. It ensures continuity. It keeps land, crowns, and even armies within a single, tightly knit bloodline. In a world where borders were drawn in blood, this was considered the safer option. And Isabella, now queen, adapts. She holds audiences with ambassadors. She advises her husband-uncle with a grace belying her youth. She writes letters to her mother, now also her mother-in-law, carefully balancing family affection with political duty. She learns to walk the razor's edge between personal discomfort and royal obligation. She learns that queenship is sometimes a cage decorated with jewels. And she learns that her children, should she bear them, will be heirs with a pedigree so compact it could fit on a single page. But here's where things get complicated. Sometimes these marriages backfired spectacularly. Some royal families experienced fertility problems, infant mortality, or fragile heirs after generations of close marriages. Some courts whispered that God was punishing overzealous dynasty tightening. Others doubled down, assuming the answer was simply more familial unity. Because medieval logic often said, if it hasn't worked, do it again but harder. You drift beside Isabella as she ages, watching her become a surprisingly competent queen, sharp-witted, politically savvy, and fully aware that her life's path was chosen long before her birth. She never escapes the shadow of her marriage, but she manages to mold that shadow into a space where she can exert influence, protect her interests, and guide the next generation. And as you step away from her world, the corridor before you twists slightly, another reminder that medieval genealogy was less a tree and more a spiraling staircase. One these women walked with quiet courage. Even when the steps felt steep, you drift forward, and the air changes again, lighter, sharper, tinged with the awkwardness of a situation that even medieval chroniclers sometimes side-eyed. Because now you're stepping into the lives of two royal sisters who married the same cousin king. Not at the same time, of course, but in that strange medieval, well, one sister has died, so the other one will do, way that makes you pause mid-stride and whisper, that's certainly a choice. You enter a sun-splashed palace courtyard where two sisters, let's call them Eleanor and Matilda for clarity, are chasing each other as children. Their laughter rings against the stone, innocent and bright. And standing at the edge of the courtyard is a boy a few years older, watching them with that mixture of royal arrogance and childhood curiosity. This boy will one day become king, and also, awkwardly, both sisters' husband. Eleanor, the elder sister, grows into her role with practiced poise. Everyone tells her she'll make a perfect queen. She's graceful, diplomatic, fluent in the unspoken rules of courtly survival. And because medieval matchmaking loves a theme, the king she's promised to is not just a suitable ruler, but also her first cousin, their mothers being sisters or their fathers being brothers, depending on which dynasty we're drifting through tonight. Mainstream fact: it wasn't unusual for medieval kings to marry their cousins, nor was it unusual for a widowed king to then marry another cousin from the same branch. Royal houses treated marriage like Lego pieces. If one snapped off, they grabbed another from the same set. You drift through Eleanor's wedding, a cathedral filled with incense thick enough to chew, tapestries glowing red and gold, nobles whispering behind jeweled hands. She steps toward her cousin husband with serene composure, though you catch the slightest tremble when she clasps his hand. Weddings were public theatre, not personal milestones. And for a while, life is stable. Eleanor becomes queen. She oversees feasts, forges alliances, and manages the usual headaches of medieval queenship. Pushy churchmen, tense diplomats, suspicious nobles, and at least one court lady whose entire personality is gossip. But then, tragedy strikes: an illness, a childbirth complication, or simply the brutal unpredictability of medieval life. Eleanor dies young. Her body is laid in a cold stone tomb, candles flickering around her, court mourners performing grief with appropriate solemnity. And now, the political problem. The king needs an heir. The alliance must be preserved. And Eleanor's younger sister Matilda, quietly grieving and entirely unprepared, suddenly becomes the next logical choice. You feel the heaviness settle into Matilda's steps as she's summoned. She stands before advisors who offer condolences with the same breath used to discuss marriage contracts. She knew her sister's husband well. They grew up together, attended the same feasts, teased each other as children, but she never expected to be offered like this. Yet here she is, being positioned as the new queen in the very court where her sister once stood. Historians still argue whether women in Matilda's position had any real choice, or whether royal duty simply steamrolled personal grief. Some think these marriages had emotional undercurrents, shared memories, shared childhoods, even shared comfort. Others believe they were purely mechanical, the cold logic of dynastic maintenance clicking into place. Either way, Matilda's wedding feels different, somber, heavier, the same cathedral, the same king, the same crown. But the bride is different, quieter, more hesitant, carrying the ghost of Eleanor beside her like an uninvited bridesmaid. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Some chroniclers noted that kings who married sisters often kept wearing the same signet ring, gifted by the first wife. Medieval jewelry choices? Bold and awkward. As queen, Matilda spends her early months both fulfilling royal duties and navigating emotional minefields. Courtiers compare her to Eleanor in whispers they think she can't hear. Advisors treat her kindly but cautiously. Even the king seems torn between habit and guilt. You drift beside Matilda as she learns to breathe again inside a life that once belonged to her sister. But Matilda is sharper than anyone realizes. She grows into her role, shaping court politics with a quieter, more deliberate hand. She strengthens alliances, encourages religious foundations, and becomes a stabilizing force in a kingdom that desperately needs balance after so much loss. And gradually, something unexpected happens. Matilda earns respect on her own terms, not as the replacement, not as the second sister, but as a queen who understands the fragile machinery of dynastic politics and operates it with surprising finesse. The king, too, adjusts. Their partnership becomes functional, even warm. Not a love story, but a story of two people bound by loss, duty, and the bizarre circumstances of royalty. Still, the whispers persist. You hear them in the shadowed corners of the palace. Two sisters married the same man. No wonder their children look so similar. It keeps the bloodline pure, but at what cost? And that's the quiet truth you drift away with. These marriages weren't accidents. They were intentional strategies designed to preserve lineage, territory, and political leverage. But for the women forced into them, the experience blended duty, grief, identity, and an emotional complexity the chroniclers rarely wrote down. Matilda's life, like Eleanor's, becomes a hinge in the family's lineage. You move onward through the flickering shadows of medieval genealogy, and the corridor bends so sharply you feel the air tighten, because now you're stepping into the life of a royal woman whose family tree doesn't branch outward but curves back toward itself. A woman who, by the cold math of ancestry, wasn't just her husband's cousin, but his double cousin, or his cousin through one line and double cousin through another, or, in one notorious case, cousin once removed and again on the other side. Tonight, you meet the princess who was her husband's double cousin, a woman whose pedigree chart looks less like a tree and more like a laurel wreath someone accidentally glued into a circle. Picture her, a poised young woman sitting before a stained glass window, sunlight coloring her face in ruby and gold. She's reading a letter, and you can see the faint tension at the corners of her mouth, because the letter says exactly what she's been anticipating since childhood. You will marry your cousin, the same one we've been grooming you for since before you could walk. See, her parents were themselves cousins, possibly first cousins, possibly second, but also connected through an additional line. And her groom's parents, likewise, were linked back to her family multiple ways. So when the matchmakers placed her with this particular cousin, they weren't just drawing two branches together, they were tying a knot. Mainstream fact: double cousin marriages, while not as common as simple first cousin pairings, were absolutely a tool of medieval politicking. They created exceptionally clean lines of inheritance, meaning heirs whose claims were reinforced from both sides of the family. But here's your quirky tidbit. In at least one royal household, scribes had to produce a diagram showing exactly how the bride and groom were related, because even the courtiers were getting confused. The document survives, and it looks like medieval genealogy attempted interpretive dance. You hover behind the princess as she prepares for the marriage that will define her fate. She doesn't get a choice. She doesn't get a vote. What she gets is a crown, a husband she already knows disturbingly well, and the knowledge that her role is to merge two already merged bloodlines even further. Her cousin husband arrives for the formal betrothal. He bows stiffly. She curtsies gently. They engage in the kind of polite conversation that has all the chemistry of wet parchment, but underneath the surface is an odd familiarity. They grew up attending the same feasts, learning from the same tutors, even playing together as toddlers. Their parents deliberately orchestrated their childhood proximity so the marriage would feel natural. But natural is not the same as comfortable. As you drift through their wedding day, the cathedral hums with political satisfaction. The families approving this match aren't just uniting two houses, they're strengthening. A single house that has already folded in on itself twice. Historians still argue whether marriages like this were considered bold, strategic masterstrokes, or desperate attempts to cling to power. Some argue these unions were necessary in kingdoms with fragile boundaries. Others suggest the opposite, that such tightly wound family networks eventually destabilized entire dynasties by limiting the pool of political allies. Either way, the princess now steps into life as a queen with a genealogical mission. You follow her into her new court. She moves with grace and intelligence, navigating the petty dramas and whispered gossip that come with being both queen and cousin. And yes, the ladies-in-waiting absolutely talk about her shared ancestry with her husband. This is the medieval equivalent of two people showing up to a party wearing the same shirt, except the shirt is multiple grandparents. She takes carefully measured steps through her duties, advises her husband, supports alliances, writes letters to her mother who is also her aunt, depending on which line you're following. Every moment of her life is a tightrope of diplomacy threaded through blood ties. But here's the strange thing. Despite the political engineering behind her marriage, the princess is surprisingly competent. She becomes a stabilizing force. She moderates her husband's impulses, negotiates with ambassadors, and manages to foster a court known for elegance rather than chaos. Even courtiers who whisper about her convoluted family background eventually come to respect her. Yet you see the private moments too. Late at night, she sits beside a fire, reading a devotional book, her face illuminated by wavering light, and there's a heaviness in her expression. A quiet understanding that her life was shaped by other people's ambitions long before she had the language to protest it. Still, she fulfills her role. she bears children. And because of the double cousin ancestry, these royal babies inherit an unusually consolidated lineage, one that doesn't know whether to branch or circle. Their chancellors brag about the purity of their blood. Their tutors note their resemblance to every relative on both sides. Their physicians raise an eyebrow, but try to keep it subtle. And you drift away from her world, recognizing something essential. Women like her were the hinges upon which entire dynasties balanced. They weren't pawns, they were keystones. Their bodies, their marriages, their children, these were the structural supports of medieval Europe. Her life wasn't about romance, it was about stability, continuity, and the relentless convergence of lineage. A double cousin, a double queen, a woman born into the loop. You drift farther down the genealogical staircase, and the flickering torchlight seems to twist around you, as if even the shadows are trying to keep track of who is related to whom and failing. Because now, you're stepping into one of the most socially awkward, quietly comedic, and deeply medieval arrangements of all. The courts where mothers-in-law were also cousins. Sometimes close cousins, sometimes double cousins, and occasionally cousins in more than one direction at once. It's the kind of relational tangle that makes you want to sit down with a cup of tea, a diagram, and maybe a deep breath. You enter a bustling great hall, warm, noisy, and perfumed with roasted meat and politics. A young royal bride stands in the center, nervous but composed. She's just arrived in her husband's kingdom, ready to begin her new life. And walking toward her, arms slightly open, is the Queen Dowager, her new mother-in-law. Except, plot twist, the older woman is also her cousin, or her double cousin, or her cousin through both grandmothers, which is absolutely a thing in medieval genealogy once you tilt your head sideways enough. Mainstream fact. In multiple European dynasties, it was common for a queen dowager to be related sometimes quite closely to her son's bride. This happened especially in tightly interwoven houses like the Habsburgs, the Capetians, the Trastamaras, and the Aragonese. The same handful of families kept intermarrying until their courts sometimes looked like family reunions with crowns. But here's your quirky tidbit. Chroniclers occasionally complained about these arrangements because it made addressing people a nightmare. You'd have to call the same woman Your Majesty, My Lady, and Dear Cousin, all depending on the context. One clerk actually wrote in frustration that a certain royal household had too many cousins to count, which is medieval passive aggression at its finest. You drift behind the young bride, let's call her Blanche, as she approaches her mother-in-law/cousin. Blanche bows, the older queen kisses her cheek, and you can feel the tension humming beneath the politeness like a lute string, pulled just a bit too tight. Because here's the thing. Medieval mother-in-law relationships were already complicated. Add cousinhood, and suddenly, power, hierarchy, and bloodlines all begin doing the genealogical equivalent of a tango. Blanche enters court life with caution. Every move she makes is observed, not just by courtiers hungry for drama, but by her mother-in-law, who understands exactly how the dynasty works, because she helped design it. Blanche knows she must treat her with deference as a queen, familiarity as a cousin, and strategic respect as a political gatekeeper. It's a trifecta no etiquette manual has ever adequately explained. Historians still argue whether these relationships were mostly warm, two related women supporting each other, or quietly competitive, with older queens guarding influence like a dragon guarding treasure. The truth, like most things medieval, probably depends on the personalities involved. You follow Blanche through her earliest days. At court, the Dowager Queen introduces her to ambassadors, shows her how the court likes its rituals performed, corrects her posture with a gentle tap, and occasionally throws out comments like, "In our family, we prefer our queens to stand like this," or, "You inherited that smile from your grandmother, who was also my aunt." You can practically hear Blanche thinking, of course she was, because everyone is everyone's aunt here. Meals are even more intense. Blanche sits between her husband, who is a cousin in multiple ways, and the Queen Dowager, who comments on family resemblance as though she's assembling a genealogical scrapbook in real time. "So similar around the eyes," she notes. "And look, Blanche has your uncle's chin. And the same complexion that runs through my mother's line. May God rest her." The courtiers nod, murmuring with interest, as if this is all perfectly routine. But the real challenge appears when political decisions roll in. Blanche, as queen, has influence. The Dowager Queen, as former queen, still has influence. And both women care deeply about the dynasty's stability. Sometimes their opinions align beautifully, like two pieces of the same puzzle. Other times, well, medieval letters describe more than one tension in the queen's chamber, which is a very polite way of saying, they argued, and half the castle heard it. One evening, you hover beside Blanche as she tries to draft a diplomatic letter. The Dowager Queen reads over her shoulder because boundaries are not a medieval hobby and gently suggests a different phrasing. Blanche clenches her jaw, forces a smile, and revises it. After all, you don't snap at your mother-in-law, or your cousin-in-law. The lines are too blurry. But over time, something unexpected emerges. Mutual respect. These two women, bound by blood and politics, begin to understand each other's burdens. They share stories, allies, memories of relatives whose portraits still hang in the Great Hall. They care for the same children. They protect the same dynasty. Their identities overlap so deeply that rivalry becomes unnecessary, almost impossible. And gradually, Blanche realizes that this complicated relationship is actually an advantage. The Dowager Queen, with her decades of experience and deep family knowledge, becomes Blanche's greatest shield. She teaches her how to outmaneuver courtiers, how to read alliances, how to survive the relentless swirl of medieval politics. And Blanche grows into her role stronger, sharper, elegant in a way that feels earned rather than inherited. By the time she becomes the unquestioned center of the court, she's no longer intimidated by her mother-in-law/cousin. Instead, she sees her as what she truly is, a mirror from another generation, reflecting both the power and the limitations of being born into a dynasty that loops back upon itself. As you drift from this court, you can still hear their intertwined footsteps, two women navigating a world where family and politics are the same thing, compressed into a single, intricate web. You drift onward, and the air around you becomes unmistakably Habsburg again, thick with velvet, ambition, and the faint genealogical dizziness that always accompanies this dynasty. Because now you're stepping into the lives of two Habsburg sisters who, quite literally, had one grandfather twice. Not metaphorically, not poetically, genetically, mathematically. The same man appears twice in their ancestry chart, like someone accidentally copied and pasted him. And you can already feel your brain preparing itself for this genealogical pretzel. You step into a candlelit chamber where two young Habsburg archduchesses, let's call them Margaret and Elizabeth, sit side by side, practicing their court manners. They look alike, strikingly alike, same jawline, same high cheeks, same eyes that sparkle with the particular brand of I've been raised to smile politely, even when my entire lineage makes no sense. And yes, you notice the resemblance because their parents were not just closely related. Their grandparents looped around in a way that would give any modern geneticist the worst migraine of their life. Mainstream fact: the Habsburg dynasty produced multiple children whose grandparents were the same person appearing twice due to uncle-niece marriages, double cousin matches, and repeated remerging of the same family branches. This was not an anomaly, it was a structural feature of the dynasty's marriage policy. But here's your quirky tidbit. One early Habsburg chronicler actually bragged that the family tree had no foreign branches, which was his way of saying, don't worry, we've been marrying each other so long, we're basically one extremely committed family project. You glide beside Margaret and Elizabeth as they learn their lessons. Their tutor explains their ancestry, with the kind of weary resignation normally reserved for explaining tax forms. Your grandfather, on your mother's side, he says, pointing at a painted portrait, is also your grandfather on your father's side. He hesitates, then adds, and yes, that means exactly what you think. The girls exchange a glance. Not quite shocked they were raised for this, but something like the dawning awareness that lineage is more complicated than court poets like to pretend. Their parents, of course, treat this situation like any other privilege of royalty. Their father proudly introduces the girls at feasts, praising their pedigree for being unbroken. Their mother softly reminds them that the purity of noble blood is a divine gift. Everyone else politely ignores the fact that the same grandfather's portrait appears twice in the family gallery. Historians still argue whether these double grandparent situations were intentional or simply the inevitable result of tightly managed breeding in a small aristocratic pool. Was it deliberate dynasty tightening? Or a desperate attempt to maintain control in a political world where alliances shifted like sand? The debate continues. You walk with the sisters through a bustling courtyard, where ambassadors and minor nobles mill around like bright, clicking chess pieces. Margaret carries herself with sharp elegance, instantly recognizable as the more politically attuned sister. Elizabeth is softer in demeanor, but sharper in intellect than most around her appreciate. Both girls are already being quietly evaluated for marriage. And the potential suitors? Shockingly, not shockingly, they are all cousins. Some first cousins, some second cousins, some cousins through one line, and double cousins through another. At one point, a matchmaker presents a chart that looks like a medieval spider web. You watch the sisters lean over it while their mother explains. This branch here, yes, your grandfather again connects, tore you to the groom's mother. And this line, yes, also your grandfather connects you through the father. Isn't that neat? The sisters exchange a silent, telepathic, sure, neat. Eventually, Margaret is married to a cousin whose lineage overlaps hers in multiple ways. The wedding is spectacular, a symphony of gold brocade, chanting priests, and suspiciously enthusiastic genealogists. Courtiers whisper about the strong union and the reinforced bloodline, even as the bishop quietly signs a dispensation that probably made him pray extra hard that night. You follow Elizabeth's path too. Her match takes longer politics, dowries, rival claims, but eventually she's paired with yet another cousin whose grandfather is also the grandfather they share twice. At this point, you're tempted to draw the family tree yourself, except you'd run out of paper trying to map all the loops. And yet, despite all the complexity, the sisters thrive. Margaret becomes a respected queen consort known for her discipline and diplomatic skill. Elizabeth develops a reputation for kindness, charity, and intelligence. They write letters to each other, tiny, elegant scrolls filled with updates, jokes, and references to shared memories. You catch one line, delicately phrased. It seems our grandfather, in all his forms, continues to follow us. Their children are eerily similar in appearance. Courtiers note the familiar Habsburg features emerging stronger, especially the jawline that will later become legendary. Midwives whisper about the uncanny resemblance between cousins, and the palace painters, possibly confused, begin painting portraits of children who look so alike that future historians will struggle to identify who's who. But through it all, the sisters remain close, connected not just by sisterhood, but by the strange, looping architecture of their ancestry. You leave their world with an image that stays with you. Two Habsburg women walking through a torchlit hall, gowns rustling softly, their features unmistakably similar because they were shaped by the same man twice long before they were born. And by the time you're drifting away, you realize this isn't the climax of Habsburg ancestry. It's just the warm-up. You drift forward, deeper into the haze of medieval dynastic chess. And the world around you seems to sigh, exasperated, resigned, amused, because now you're stepping into the life of a royal woman whose marriage looks normal on the surface, until you tilt your head and realize it absolutely is not. Tonight, you meet a queen who married her first cousin, twice removed, which is one of those phrases that sounds mild until you remember medieval Europe treated twice removed like, close enough. You find her sitting in a warm study, parchment spread out before her. She's about 18, sharp-eyed, with that calm, well-trained expression royal daughters learn long before they understand politics. Let's call her Constance because half the medieval noble women in Europe seemed named Eleanor, Isabel, Margaret, or Constance. And you deserve some variety. Constance grew up knowing she'd marry someone related, but the exact shape of that relationship was flexible. Medieval matchmakers didn't treat cousinhood as a boundary. They treated it like seasoning. Sprinkle a little, sprinkle a lot, just enough to tie two families together without accidentally starting a war. Mainstream fact. First cousin marriages were common, but first cousins once or twice removed were even more popular. They were close enough to strengthen the dynasty, but far enough for the church to pretend it wasn't too scandalous. After issuing a dispensation, of course, because nothing says romance like papal paperwork. But your quirky tidbit for this section. In one royal court, they actually held a public genealogy reading before the wedding, like medieval stand-up comedy. But instead of jokes, it was a monk explaining how the bride and groom were related through 6 different ancestor lines. People applauded. Truly a different time. You follow Constance as she's summoned to a council chamber thick with murmuring advisors. Her parents sit at the head of a long wooden table, illuminated by the firelight. Maps are spread everywhere, alliances drawn in ink, and her father leans forward with a smile that's both affectionate and strategic. Your future husband, he says, is a good man, strong, pious. Constance nods, waiting for the part she already suspects. And, he adds, he's family. Of course he is, but this time it's not a close cousin. It's a first cousin twice removed, which is medieval shorthand for still definitely a cousin, but with enough genealogical distance to make the legal side slightly easier. Constance's betrothed is the son of her father's cousin, or the grandson of her grandmother's brother, or some combination of those depending on the dynasty you're drifting through. But you get the idea. It's tangled, confusing, and deeply on brand for this era. She meets him for the first time in an audience hall. He's older, late 20s, maybe early 30s, handsome in that I've been trained to stand like a statue way. He bows. She curtsies. Their eyes meet for half a second, and you sense an odd warmth, a mutual awareness that neither wanted this, but both were prepared for it. Marriage in medieval royalty wasn't about love, it was about calculus. And tonight, you're watching medieval math at work. The wedding preparations sweep into motion. Courtiers bustle like bees. Priests prepare the necessary dispensations. Tailors stitch gold thread into Constance's gown. And through it all, she maintains serene composure even when ladies-in-waiting whisper about how she and her groom share a great-grandparent or two. During the ceremony itself, in a grand cathedral dripping with candlelight, Constance stands beside her cousin husband and recites vows she learned by heart as a child. The choir echoes through the vast stone nave. The air smells of incense, lilies, and political expectation. And as the priest blesses them, you feel Constance's breath steady, as though she's stepping into a role she was born to play. After the wedding, Constance moves into her husband's court, a place bursting with new aromas, customs, and the occasional judgmental aunt. And here, you meet her mother-in-law, who is also, somehow, her cousin. It's medieval genealogy. There are no surprises left. Constance adapts quickly. She learns the court's rhythms, its whispers, its games. She perfects the art of speaking in half-truths and smiling through every possible emotional weather pattern. She becomes a queen consort not by force, but by quiet brilliance. Historians still argue whether her marriage, this first cousin twice-removed arrangement, was actually healthier than closer unions, or if it simply delayed the same hereditary patterns that plagued so many dynasties. Some say it helped broaden the bloodline. Others claim it was merely the illusion of diversity, like drawing a wider circle around the same family. You drift beside Constance as she begins her work, negotiating alliances, sponsoring scholars, handling court disputes, advocating for peasants at times, always a PR win, learning to read ambassadors' expressions like maps, and then, finally, she becomes a mother. Her children inherit 2 versions of the same ancestral lines, like getting the same book printed in different fonts. Courtiers note their resemblance to both sides of the family, but the similarities are uncanny, like echoes of generations repeating themselves. Still, Constance raises them with remarkable steadiness. She cultivates their intelligence, tempers their pride, teaches them diplomacy, and encourages something most royal houses forgot: kindness. And the kingdom flourishes. You leave her court with one last image: Constance standing at a balcony, sunlight warming her face, her children playing below. She looks strong, certain, at peace with the strange genealogical path her life took. Because, for her, the line between blood and duty was never a line at all. It was a spiral. She learned to walk with grace. A queen by birth. A queen by marriage. A queen in a dynasty that looped her back to her own ancestors twice removed, yet forever close. You drift onward, deeper into the genealogical fog of medieval Europe, and the air takes on a strange heaviness, like you've stepped into a chamber where every torch flickers just a little too quietly. Because now, you're meeting the women who weren't just married into close-kin unions, but born from them. Tonight you step into the lives of royal daughters whose parents were uncle and niece, making these young women the living embodiment of dynasty tightening, taken to its absolute edge. You find yourself in a private nursery, warm, quiet, filled with carved wooden toys and embroidered blankets. A newborn girl sleeps in a cradle in the center of the room. Her mother sits beside her, exhausted but glowing, looked upon with reverence by attendants who whisper about the infant's destiny. But there's an undercurrent, an unspoken tension humming beneath every smile. Because everyone in this room knows the match that produced this child was controversial, even by medieval standards. Her father is her mother's uncle. Her mother is her father's niece. Two branches of the same family, looped together. And the child, let's call her Beatrice, has inherited a bloodline so tightly folded it would make any modern genetic counselor faint. Mainstream fact. Uncle-niece marriages produce children with exceptionally high coefficients of relatedness, higher than typical first-cousin offspring, and closer to what you'd expect from sibling-level shared ancestry. Several European dynasties took this risk anyway, especially the Habsburgs, the Trastamaras of Castile, and certain Italian noble houses. But here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval astrologers believed children from such unions were destined for greatness, because they carried the purest essence of their houses. Completely wrong biologically, extremely confident astrologically. As Beatrice grows, you follow her footsteps through stone corridors lined with ancestors whose portraits appear suspiciously similar. She has her father's eyes, her mother's smile, and the uncanny blended look of someone who inherited identical genes from both sides of her family. By age 6, she already understands she is special. Not because she's royal, she knew that part, but because tutors whisper about her perfect lineage with a reverence that feels almost ceremonial. Her mother watches over her with fierce protectiveness. She knows the whispers that circulate through the court. Will the child be healthy? Will she thrive? Will she claim her inheritance? Or will fate intervene? In an age of limited genetics, people didn't have vocabulary for these fears, but they had instincts. And here's where historians still argue, fiercely. Were these daughters intentionally groomed to continue the pattern? Or did the biological consequences of such unions lead to more fragile lines that required extra political compensation? No consensus exists, just heated academic arguments and stacks of genealogical charts that look like someone scribbled circles around circles. As adolescence arrives, Beatrice blossoms into a poised, intelligent young woman. She speaks 3 languages. She rides horses with confidence. She participates in courtly debates with a quiet precision that makes older nobles raise an eyebrow and reconsider underestimating her. But Beatrice's destiny is already written in the blood she carries. Her marriage negotiators don't look outside the dynasty. They look inward. They identify cousins on both maternal and paternal lines, sometimes the same cousins, because the goal isn't diversity. The goal is consolidation. One day, she's summoned to a council chamber where maps and parchments lie scattered like battlefield remains. Her father sits stiffly. Her mother dabs tears discreetly. And Beatrice understands before anyone speaks. "You will secure our lineage," her father says. "You will unite both branches," her mother adds softly. And so, of course, her groom is a cousin, not a distant one, not some mild third cousin twice removed. No, this cousin shares grandparents with her on one line, and great-grandparents on another. This, in medieval mathematics, is perfect alignment. This, in modern genetics, is a left-eye twitch waiting to happen. The wedding is breathtaking, cathedral arches blazing with candlelight, choirs echoing so beautifully you momentarily forget the genealogical drama behind it. Beatrice stands beside her cousin husband, serene as ever. She doesn't tremble. She doesn't falter. She's been prepared for this her entire life. And surprisingly, she thrives in her new role. Beatrice becomes a capable queen, strategic, perceptive, firm, when necessary. She cultivates alliances, manages court factions, and demonstrates a kind of unshakable presence that makes even seasoned ambassadors think twice before underestimating her. But you're also granted access to her private moments. Late at night, She lights a single candle and reads letters from her mother, letters filled with tenderness and coded warnings. Letters reminding her to rest, to pray, to stay vigilant, to embrace joy despite the weight of her birth. She bears children, each of whom carries the hyper-concentrated ancestry of both sides of the dynasty. Courtiers marvel at how strongly the family features appear: same eyes, same jawline, same unmistakable silhouette. Midwives share cautious glances, hoping the infants inherit strength, not fragility, and Beatrice watches over them fiercely, aware of the stakes. Her life reflects a truth few talked about openly. Some women were not just placed into tangled lineages, they originated from them, born from uncle-niece unions, raised to embody the dynasty, trained to continue the spiral. And as you drift away from her world, you carry the image of a woman who bore the weight of ancestry not as a burden, but as a crown shaped by loops of bloodline, sharpened by duty, strengthened by sheer resilience. You drift onward, and the torchlight warms, brightens, softens, because now you're stepping into courts that feel familiar in tone, yet completely distinct in temperament. Welcome to Iberia, where the sun beats hot, the politics run hotter, and royal families connected themselves so tightly across Castile, Aragon, Portugal, and Navarre that entire dynasties sometimes felt like one extended, very dramatic holiday gathering. Tonight you meet the sister queens of Iberia, women whose lives unfolded like mirrored stories across neighboring kingdoms, united not only by the crowns they married into, but by bloodlines that wrapped around each other like braided threads. Imagine a bustling palace courtyard in Castile, warm stone, fluttering banners, the scent of oranges on the breeze. Two royal sisters, let's call them Leonor and Sancha, walk arm in arm, their dresses catching the late afternoon sun. They're young, clever, raised on the same tutors, lullabies, and whispered warnings about navigating royal life. And both of them, destined to marry their cousins, but in different kingdoms, at almost the same time. Because Iberian dynasties loved a good pattern. Mainstream fact: medieval Iberian monarchies frequently arranged sister marriages, one girl to the King of Castile, one to the King of Aragon, or one to Portugal, one to Navarre. These alliances united Christian kingdoms during centuries of reconquest and political tension. It was practical, strategic, and incredibly predictable. But here's your quirky tidbit. Iberian chroniclers sometimes describe these sister marriages as doubling the virtue, as if sending two sisters into different courts guaranteed synchronized political harmony. Spoiler, it absolutely did not. You follow Leonor first. She's sent to Aragon, married to a cousin a few years older. He's charismatic, stubborn, and deeply proud. She adapts quickly, mastering the sharp-edged politics of Aragon's Cortes, where nobles speak their minds with almost alarming enthusiasm. Leonor becomes a steadying force, diplomatic, calm, quietly fierce. Meanwhile, her sister Sancha travels west, crossing into Portugal. Her groom is also a cousin, handsome, reserved, thoughtful, but his court is no less complicated. Portuguese politics are full of ambitious nobles, church influence, and border tensions with Castile. Sancha steps into the chaos with unexpected grace, using charm where Leonor uses strategy. And here's where things get deliciously complicated. These two kingdoms, Aragon and Portugal, are constantly negotiating, competing, and occasionally feuding. And standing at the center of these tensions, two sisters, two cousins turned queens, two women writing to each other every week in secret envoys. Historians still argue whether sister queen networks stabilized Iberia or made the political landscape even more tangled. Some claim they created unprecedented cooperation. Others insist they allowed personal rivalries to bleed into national policy. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the whispered letters. You drift alongside Leonor as she navigates a difficult council session. Her cousin husband is frustrated with Castile. Aragonese nobles are pushing for firmer borders, and in her lap sits a fresh letter from Sancha, delivered by a trusted envoy. Sancha writes, "Speak softly to your king. The Portuguese court grows uneasy. Tell him this quarrel is not worth the harvests we would both lose." Leonor folds the letter, takes a quiet breath, and begins to strategically nudge her husband's temper in a more reasonable direction. She knows her sister's words carry truth. She knows their bond might prevent a border skirmish. But of course, the universe loves symmetry and trouble. Because in Portugal, Sancha faces her own crisis. Her husband distrusts Aragon's motives. His nobles whisper that Leonor is manipulating policy through sisterhood. And yet Sancha stands her ground, defending Leonor's honesty, her intentions, her insight. Two queens, two courts, two mirrors across the peninsula. You drift between them like a messenger, watching their stories unfold in parallel. They never choose their marriages, they accept them as duty. They never choose their kingdoms, they adapt to them with dignity. But they choose each other. Correspondence becomes their lifeline. Their children grow up hearing both Castilian and Portuguese songs. Courtiers joke that the cousins look like siblings. And occasionally, because medieval politics never misses a chance, these children marry each other, turning the sister queens into mothers-in-law to each other's lineage. By the time a decade passes, Leonor and Sancha have become pivotal figures across Iberia. Ambassadors mention them in dispatches. Priests praise their piety. Merchants admire their generosity. And nobles, though sometimes threatened by their influence, quietly admit they keep the peace in ways wars never could. And you see the truth clearly. These sister queens weren't simply married into cousin unions. They were the living bridges between kingdoms. Diplomacy incarnate. Stability woven from flesh and blood. One evening, you drift into a quiet chapel where Leonor kneels in prayer. A single candle flickers beside her. She whispers a prayer not for her own kingdom but for Sancha's. Later that same night, across the peninsula, Sancha does the same. Their bond transcends politics. Their loyalty shapes borders. You drift deeper into the medieval labyrinth, and the air seems to twist in a soft, amused spiral. Because now you're stepping into a story so tangled, it feels like the writer's room of some medieval soap opera went completely off the rails. Tonight, you meet a princess who was both a niece and a sister-in-law to the same woman, and also tied to her husband through multiple cousin lines. It's the kind of family arrangement that makes you stare at the genealogical chart and whisper, "Absolutely not," while medieval royalty cheerfully replied, "Oh yes, absolutely yes." You materialize in a sunlit courtyard where a teenage princess, let's call her Adelaide, is practicing her court curtsy. Her gown is heavy, embroidered with gold thread, and her hair is braided with jewels her attendants handle like holy relics. Adelaide is no ordinary royal daughter. She's the product of a family so densely interwoven that even her governess occasionally pauses mid-lesson to mutter, "Now remember, child, when they say uncle, make sure you clarify which one." Adelaide is the niece of a ruling queen. Call her Queen Isabella, who happens to wield enormous political influence. Isabella is elegant, formidable, always surrounded by a cloud of silks and advisors. She dotes on Adelaide, coaching her in the art of diplomacy, with affection, and let's be honest, a touch of strategic grooming. But here's where the plot twists. Isabella doesn't just want Adelaide to be a refined lady of the court. She wants her to marry Isabella's brother-in-law, who is also Adelaide's cousin. Yep, we're already in spicy territory. Mainstream fact. It was incredibly common for medieval noblewomen to become sisters-in-law to their own aunts or uncles due to cousin marriages and political matchmaking. Royal courts functioned like tightly knit networks where family roles overlapped constantly. But here's your quirky tidbit. One chronicler joked that in a certain Iberian court, everyone's mother was also someone's cousin and someone's aunt, occasionally at the same feast. Historians believe he wasn't exaggerating, just exhausted. You drift forward to the moment Adelaide is summoned into a grand audience chamber. The pillars soar above her, carved angels stare down in judgment, and the floor gleams with polished stone. Queen Isabella sits on a raised dais, wearing a look that can only be described as, "I have a plan, and you're going to love it, or at least pretend to." "My sweet girl," Isabella says, reaching for her hand, "a match has been arranged for you." Adelaide already knows what that means. She has grown up surrounded by marriage politics, betrothal rumors, and carefully curated alliances. Still, she had hoped for something less complicated. The groom? Isabella's brother-in-law. Which means if Adelaide marries him, Isabella becomes both her aunt and her sister-in-law. When Adelaide processes this, she does not faint, not because she isn't shocked, but because she's already endured years of Habsburg-adjacent tutoring. Nothing surprises these girls anymore. The betrothal proceeds quickly. The court buzzes with speculation. Some whisper about the brilliance of strengthening ties within the dynasty. Others quietly wonder if this level of interfamily looping might be pushing it. And scholars then, and now still, argue whether Isabella orchestrated this to consolidate her influence, or simply because the cousin was available, politically convenient, and sufficiently noble. You drift into the wedding cathedral. Candles blaze, music echoes. Adelaide walks down the aisle between rows of nobles who absolutely already have opinions. Her cousin husband waits at the altar, a man she's known all her life, sometimes admired, sometimes teased, sometimes avoided during awkward family dinners. Their vows echo through the stone vaults. Their rings glint in the candlelight. And Queen Isabella, now both aunt and sister-in-law, beams like she's watching a masterful piece of political theatre. Adelaide moves into her new household, and the comedic awkwardness begins almost immediately. At meals, if she says, Aunt Isabella, half the table looks up. If she says, my sister-in-law, the other half does. Her ladies-in-waiting privately debate what title should technically come first. One finally throws her hands up and declares, just call her my lady and hope for the best. Still, Adelaide adapts. She's sharp, observant, and because this is medieval royalty trained to transform chaos into grace, her husband respects her, often listens to her, and occasionally whispers, let's not tell my mother you disagreed with her, which is basically medieval pillow talk. Scholars note that Adelaide's influence grows significantly. She tempers court rivalries. She negotiates disputes. She writes letters so diplomatic they could soothe a civil war. And through it all, Isabella remains in her life, sometimes mentor, sometimes rival, always family in at least two simultaneous ways. One night, you drift into Adelaide's private chamber. She sits by the fire, reading a letter from her eldest sister, who asks, so, is she more your aunt or your sister-in-law this week? Adelaide smiles and writes back, yes, because that's the truth. She is both, always both. And somehow through sheer willpower and political acumen, Adelaide thrives anyway. Her children inherit a tightly interlaced bloodline and a network of alliances so intricate it practically sparkles. Ambassadors praise her judgment, nobles fear her intellect, and future historians, brow furrowed, squint at family trees trying to understand how one woman can occupy so many relational categories at once. But you see it clearly as you drift away. Adelaide's role wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate knot in the dynastic net, a stabilizing thread in a world woven from ancestry and obligation. Niece, sister-in-law, cousin, queen. A woman stitched into the dynasty so tightly it's almost poetic. You drift onward, and the air shifts gently, richly into the scent of southern courts. Polished olive wood, citrus blossoms, warm breezes drifting in from the Mediterranean. Because now you step into a chapter where the genealogical spirals stretch across multiple royal houses, interlocking like gears in an ornate medieval clock. Tonight you meet the royal women shared between two interwoven dynasties, French, Aragonese, and Portuguese bloodlines merging, separating, and merging again until no one is entirely sure where one house ends and the other begins. You appear in a candlelit salon in southern France, where a princess, let's call her Yolande, is having her hair braided by two attendants. She's sharp-eyed, thoughtful, and absolutely surrounded by whispers. Because Yolande has been raised with a very particular expectation. She is not just a daughter of one dynasty. She is a bridge between dynasties. Her mother is French, her father is Aragonese, her grandmother is Portuguese, and her great-grandmother, a cousin to all of them. Yolande's family tree looks less like a tree and more like an embroidered mandala. Mainstream fact, throughout the 13th-15th centuries, the royal houses of France, Aragon, and Portugal intermarried so frequently that entire generations of daughters were born poised to connect and reconnect the same families again and again. Kings sought unity, queens maintained alliances, and princesses like Yolande were raised knowing their marriages were tools of transnational diplomacy. But here's your quirky tidbit. One French chronicler described these three houses as the tripod upon which Christendom rests, which is poetic medieval code for everyone here keeps marrying each other. and we have no idea where these bloodlines will go. Next, you follow Yolande through the corridors of her childhood palace. She learns French courtesy, Aragonese court protocol, Portuguese song traditions, all woven into her daily life. She doesn't think of it as complex, it's just who she is. But the diplomats certainly think it's complex. One afternoon, a council gathers in a vaulted chamber. Ambassadors from France, Aragon, and Portugal cluster around a table. They analyze not wars, not taxes, not treaties, but marriages. Every name they mention is related to every other name in at least 3 ways. You catch whispers. Sire, if the Aragonese princess marries the Portuguese prince, yes. But then the French cousin must marry the Aragonese nephew, or the alignment breaks. And what of the uncle's grandchild? She could be queen of either kingdom. It's diplomacy built entirely from genealogy. A political game played with daughters. Yolande's betrothal is announced just before her 16th birthday. She's to marry her cousin, of course she is, but which cousin is the real twist? Her groom is an Aragonese prince through her father's line, and a Portuguese royal through her grandmother's line. He represents 2 of the 3 dynasties she embodies. When she meets him, the encounter feels strangely familiar. They've seen each other at festivals, shared tutors, argued as children over who got the better horse during summer visits. They greet each other now with polite smiles that hide the subtle recognition that their families have been planning this since they were toddlers. The wedding is a dazzling fusion of 3 cultures: French musicians, Aragonese banners, Portuguese embroidery, 3 worlds converging in one gold-lit cathedral. But this is only the beginning. As queen, Yolande becomes a diplomatic powerhouse. She writes letters in French, negotiates in Catalan, and prays in Portuguese Latin. Ambassadors adore her because speaking to her is like speaking to the entire peninsula at once. And, naturally, her court becomes a magnet for relatives. Cousins from Paris, Barcelona, Lisbon, Naples, all drifting in and out like actors in a never-ending family saga. Historians still argue whether this interlocking of royal houses strengthened Mediterranean politics or created fractures by concentrating too much power within too few bloodlines. Some say these alliances kept the peace. Others say they caused half the wars. And you see both arguments reflected in Yolande's life. Because while she stabilizes her kingdom, softening grand feuds, brokering trade, preventing border disputes, her extended family network pulls her in every direction. One cousin demands support against France. Another begs for neutrality in Portugal's succession crisis. Another insists she condemn a rival noble house that happens to also be her kin. Yolande navigates the chaos gracefully. But privately, she sighs, deeply. And then comes the twist that defines her legacy. She becomes the mother of children who inherit pieces of all 3 dynasties. Her eldest daughter marries into France. Her second becomes queen in Portugal. Her son strengthens Aragon's rule, and suddenly, Yolande's bloodline is everywhere, threaded across Europe like golden stitching. One late evening, you drift into her private chamber. She sits by a balcony overlooking moonlit courtyards, reading a letter from her daughter in Lisbon. It ends with a line that makes Yolande smile with a mixture of pride and weariness. "Mother, everyone here is our cousin. I think the entire palace shares one grandmother." She laughs softly, because it's true. Her life and that of her sisters, cousins, aunts, wasn't just shaped by family politics. They were the politics, women who carried dynasties not only in their wombs but in their heritage. Women whose marriages reinforced centuries of interconnected crowns. Women who understood the delicate dance of being daughter, wife, queen, and diplomat, sometimes to the same family at once. As you drift away from her court, the Mediterranean night enfolds you. The shadows of 3 dynasties swirl together. French lilies, Aragonese stripes, Portuguese shields interlocking just as their daughters did. A tapestry of shared queens, a web of mirrored bloodlines, and at its center, women like Yolande, crafted to hold kingdoms together. You drift forward, and the corridor of torchlight narrows, curling inward like a spiral staircase made of ancestry, obligation, and well-meaning medieval delusion. Because now you're stepping into the lives of granddaughter brides, young royal women who were expected to fix their family trees only to accidentally tighten them even further. These girls weren't chosen for their charm or their grace. They were chosen for their pedigree, the way a jeweler selects gems for symmetry. And tonight, you're meeting one of them. Her name, let's give her a gentle, historically friendly one, is Isabeau. You find her sitting in a quiet alcove of a great palace, sunlight catching on the embroidered lilies of her gown. She's maybe 14, perhaps 15, young, but not unaware. She's been taught since childhood that she carries something valuable in her veins, something her family calls lineage purity, though modern you would prefer terms not associated with fruit trees and pedigreed animals. Isabeau is the granddaughter of a king whose marriage to his niece shaped a dynasty. And because of that, she is considered prime marriage material, not for foreign princes, not for distant allies, but for the family. Again, mainstream fact, medieval monarchies regularly married granddaughter-level descendants back into the main line, believing this reinforced legitimacy. The practice occurred in Aragon, Castile, Portugal, early Valois France, and obviously among the Habsburgs. These unions were seen as a way to resolve branching claims. But here's your quirky tidbit. One medieval bishop described such matches as turning the tree upon itself, which is possibly the most poetic way anyone has ever said, "You folks need new bloodlines." You drift with Isabeau as she walks through gardens buzzing with bees and politics. Her grandmother, now a regal dowager queen, sits beneath an olive tree, sipping spiced wine. She beckons Isabeau over. "My sweet girl," she says, "you are our hope for unity." Isabeau nods politely, pretending she understands. She does not. She absolutely does not. Her grandmother gently explains with unsettling calm that the kingdom has descended into factional tension. Claimants are circling like hawks. Some cousins are too ambitious. Some uncles are too entitled. And the family needs someone who can anchor the bloodline with perfect legitimacy. Guess who has perfect legitimacy? The granddaughter of an uncle-niece marriage. Isabeau. She listens quietly, her hands tightening in her lap. You hear her breath catch when her grandmother adds, "You will marry your cousin, your senior cousin. It will bring peace." Of course it will. Medieval logic never misses a chance to fold the family chart a little tighter. You drift through the betrothal preparations. The scribes draft marriage contracts. The court astrologer is consulted. Someone brings out heraldic scrolls to prove how flawless this match will be. Historians still argue whether granddaughter-bride arrangements were considered bold political solutions or simply desperation disguised with silk and ceremony. Some see them as stabilizers, others as ticking time bombs. The scholarly debate is ongoing and occasionally dramatic, but for Isabeau, it's suddenly becoming very real. She meets her groom, perhaps 10 or 12 years older, a cousin in 2 ways, possibly 3. He bows stiffly, awkwardly, as if unsure whether to treat her like family or a queen in training. His smile is polite, her curtsy is flawless. They exchange the sort of conversation that feels like walking across ice. And then the wedding arrives. The cathedral is drenched in gold light. 1,000 candles glow. The choir sings until the stone trembles with sound, and the crowd buzzes with excitement not for romance, but for resolution. Isabeau walks forward with a calmness she practiced for days. Her cousin husband awaits her, his expression steady, and as they join hands, you sense the entire kingdom exhale, not from joy, from relief. After the wedding, Isabeau moves into her new household. Her new life surrounded by cousins, who are also courtiers, courtiers who are also cousins, and a mother-in-law who is also her grandaunt in at least 2 directions. It's a genealogical funhouse. She handles it astonishingly well. Isabeau learns quickly. She studies statecraft. She reviews laws. She develops a skill for quiet persuasion, disarming nobles without ever raising her voice. And gradually, something unexpected happens. Her marriage begins to steady the political waters. The rival branches soften. Ambassadors report improvement. Merchants feel safer. The people begin to whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, the granddaughter bride has fulfilled her destiny. But in her private chambers, by candlelight, Isabeau sometimes stares at the carved beams and wonders if the piece she holds together is just another temporary knot In a looping pattern, her children will be forced to tighten again. When she bears her first child a son, the midwives murmur about how strongly he resembles every relative on every side. He looks like the family. All of the family. At once. Courtiers celebrate. Scholars smile knowingly. Her grandmother weeps with joy. Isabeau holds the infant close, whispering that she hopes quietly, fiercely, that he will have a future where marriages aren't decided by charts, where daughters are not solutions, and where bloodlines don't wrap themselves into spirals. But she also knows this is medieval Europe. Her hope is centuries ahead of its time. You step back from her world with the quiet realization that granddaughter brides were never meant to escape the spiral. They were meant to tighten it, to stabilize it, to hold it together with grace. And somehow, astonishingly, they did. You drift onward, and the hall narrows into a dim, echoing corridor that feels strangely generational, like you're walking through time itself, with footsteps ahead of you, belonging to people who haven't even been born yet. Because now you're approaching a story so neatly, so ironically tangled, that even the medieval chroniclers had to pause and say, "Wait, run that back again." Tonight, you meet two half-sisters who married father-son kings. A genealogical loop so elegant and so bewildering that it practically folds the family lineage into a medieval pretzel. You step into a quiet solar, where a queen, let's call her Amélie, is brushing the hair of her much younger half-sister, Rosamund. Sunlight streams through a narrow window, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny suspended stars. Amélie hums as she works, gentle and careful, unaware that she is preparing her sister for a future that will echo her own in ways no one can yet imagine. Amélie is the elder, daughter of a king and his first wife. Rosamund is the child of the king and his second wife. They share a father, but not a mother. Two sisters of the same bloodline, raised under the same roof, for completely different destinies. Amélie is already queen, married to a man 20 years older than she is, the reigning king of a neighboring realm. Their marriage was arranged with fanfare, alliances, and more ink on contracts than affection in their hearts. But Amélie adapted. She learned the rhythms of queenship. She learned when to speak, when to step aside, and when to use silence as a weapon. She even learned to tolerate her cousin ladies gossiping about her husband's temperament, which is medieval code for he's moody and kind of dramatic. Rosamund, meanwhile, grows up watching her half-sister navigate a world of velvet and politics. She idolizes Amélie, her poise, her intelligence, her subtlety. And as she matures into a young woman, courtiers begin to whisper that Rosamund resembles Amélie at the same age. Same hair, same posture, same stubborn tilt to the chin. And now comes the plot twist. Mainstream fact. Medieval dynasties frequently arranged marriages between half-siblings and the same family line of rulers, especially when cementing alliances across generations. But marrying one half-sister to the father and the other to the son, that's a real historical pattern, appearing in Iberia, France, Navarre, and occasionally in German principalities. But here's your quirky tidbit. One chronicler describing such a marriage arrangement simply wrote, "The king desired the fruit, though he had already eaten of the tree," which is possibly the most medieval way to say, he married the younger sister after the elder died. Because yes, that's what happens. Amélie's husband, the king, dies after years of struggle, illness, old age, political exhaustion. Take your pick. Amélie becomes a dowager queen, respected and powerful, but suddenly without official influence. She returns to her homeland for a period of mourning, bringing her household with her. And Rosamund watches, wide-eyed, as her sister, once radiant and untouchable, walks through the palace in black veils, grief turning her regal silence into something deeper. Yet before long, politics comes knocking again. The new king, the old king's son from a previous wife, must secure alliances. He is young, ambitious, sharp as a drawn blade, and someone suggests, perhaps half-jokingly at first, what about the late queen's sister, Rosamund? And suddenly the idea grows legs, arms, and a marriage contract. You drift into a council chamber where ambassadors whisper about the symbolic beauty of the alliance. The new king marrying into the same family as his father, continuing the pact, preserving the line. Historians still argue whether these marriages were arranged to maintain political continuity, cement dynastic symbolism, prevent rival houses from gaining influence, or simply because royal matchmakers loved symmetry. The debate never ends. Rosamund is summoned. She stands in the great hall, nerves fluttering beneath her carefully composed face. Her father explains the match. Her mother cries quietly, and Amélie, her half-sister, squeezes her hands and says gently, "You will be queen, as I was, but your path will be different." The wedding is glorious, full of triumph and promise. But beneath the surface, currents swirl. Rosamund's new husband is charismatic but volatile, eager to make his mark. He sees her partly as a bride and partly as a symbol, one that binds him to the past while securing his future. And here's where things get complicated, because Amélie is still alive, still present, still a political figure, a widow of the former king, the stepmother, technically of her sister's new husband, and also her sister's sister, and her husband's former equals, and now a relative twice, over. Medieval court titles simply were not built for this. One moment, Rosamund addresses Amélie as "my lady," the next as "sister," and in one particularly confusing scene, "mother-in-law," which causes a nearby scribe to drop his quill in despair. You watch the two sisters navigate their overlapping roles with grace and almost supernatural communication. They stay united, Amélie advising Rosamund, Rosamund protecting Amélie's influence at court. Together, they manage a king who is sometimes brilliant, sometimes reckless, always surrounded by advisors with opinions. Rosamund eventually becomes beloved by her people. Her warmth, her patience, her charm, all qualities honed in the shadow of Amélie's legacy, win hearts across the kingdom. She has children who represent the continuation of both marriages, both generations, both loops of the dynasty. And Amélie? She becomes the kingdom's quiet power, a mentor, a stabilizer, a reminder that queenship comes in more than one form. In private moments, the sisters speak quietly near hearth fires. Amélie shares lessons learned from her first marriage. Rosamund confesses her fears. They hold hands, laugh softly, remember childhood. They are both queens of two generations, of two kings, of one dynasty. As you drift away from their intertwined lives, you feel the gentle ache of their story, a loop made not only of marriages and politics, but of sisterhood, surviving the strange and beautiful symmetry of fate. Two half-sisters, two kings, one spiraling lineage, they both held steady. You move forward, and the air thickens, not with dust or incense this time, but with that unmistakable, slightly dizzying feeling of walking into a genealogical paradox. Because now, at last, you arrive at one of the most extreme, most whispered about, most mathematically impossible seeming cases in all medieval Europe. Tonight, you meet the Habsburg Archduchess, who was on paper, on parchment, and in the cold, merciless logic of ancestry, her own great niece. And yes, that is exactly as wild as it sounds. You emerge into a long, echoing hallway, lined with portraits, stern Habsburg men, with long jaws and solemn brows. Elegant Habsburg women, with eyes that seem to watch you because, frankly, many of them share enough face-shape similarities to feel like the same person at different ages. And there, at the end of the hall, a window floods the corridor with pale morning light. Standing in that glow is the woman you've come to meet, an archduchess we'll call Magdalena, young, composed, draped in brocade, heavy enough to knock out a mid-sized goat. She stands with the serenity of someone raised to believe her lineage is not just important but sacred. It's not her fault her family tree looks like a Mobius strip doing a cartwheel. You glide beside her as she moves through the palace, and you're immediately struck by how everyone treats her with extraordinary reverence. Not just because she's royal, not just because she's intelligent, but because she carries a pedigree so pure, so concentrated, so divinely aligned, that the courtiers speak of her blood like it's alchemical gold. Mainstream fact. Several famous Habsburgs had ancestry so convoluted that their genealogical loops overlapped multiple times. In at least one major documented case, a woman's grandparents and great-grandparents overlapped so dramatically that she was biologically closer to being her own ancestor than any healthy human should be. But here's your quirky tidbit. One genealogist, a very bold man with a quill and too much free time, reportedly fainted while trying to map one of these loops, prompting the Archduchess's governess to mutter, "He should have had more breakfast," which feels like peak Habsburg energy. Magdalena's situation begins 2 generations before her birth, when her grandparents, already cousins, married into lines that were themselves the 510, product of uncle-niece unions. Her parents, also cousins, also connected through the same looping lines. Some ancestors appear once, others appear twice, some appear 4 times. It's not a family tree anymore. It's an Ouroboros, an ancestor serpent eating its own genealogical tail. As a child, Magdalena is surrounded by tutors who treat her as a living artifact. They teach her languages, courtly behavior, theology, and, crucially, genealogy. She can identify which of her ancestors married their cousins, which married their nieces, which blended both patterns, and which contributed to her unusual position in the dynasty. Historians still argue whether Magdalena's elders intentionally engineered her lineage or whether it was the culmination of centuries of insular Habsburg marriage policy. Some call it strategic consolidation, others call it inevitable collapse. The debate remains deliciously unresolved. You follow her through a diplomatic gathering where ambassadors from nearly every major European court have assembled. Their eyes follow Magdalena with fascination. She is, after all, the living embodiment of centuries of dynastic ambition. Look, one whispering envoy murmurs to another, she is the mirror of her mother and her mother's aunt. Impossible, the second envoy replies. Not with their family, the first says, sipping wine grimly. But Magdalena herself? She's calm, confident, sharp. Her intelligence is clear in every glance. Her posture radiates a kind of self-awareness, rare in royal courts, because she knows she is not just extraordinary, she is symbolic. Still, there is a quiet sadness beneath her composed exterior. One evening, you drift into a private chamber where she sits before a mirror, brushing her long, dark hair. She studies her reflection not with vanity, but with contemplation, and you feel the weight of what she knows. Her future marriage is already arranged. The groom is, of course, a cousin, one connected to her through multiple ancestral loops. A match designed to merge lines already tangled beyond reason. But Magdalena is no passive player. She gently but firmly negotiates her terms. Influence in policy, control over her household, and the right to correspond freely with foreign courts. She will not be merely a vessel of ancestry. She will be a queen, a diplomat, a strategist. The wedding itself is a spectacle of staggering opulence. 1,000 candles, Flemish tapestries, a choir so skilled the rafters vibrate. Magdalena stands beside her groom, a solemn young man whose ancestry mirrors hers almost exactly. Their family resemblance is so strong that one courtier jokes privately, very privately, "I've seen siblings who look less alike." You drift into their early married life. They are surprisingly functional as a couple, gentle with each other, supportive, even kind. Medieval marriage success metrics were not high by modern standards, but by those standards, this is practically wholesome. As Magdalena grows into her queenship, she becomes invaluable. She manages estates, guides legislation, soothes rival factions, corresponds with scholars, and, importantly, advocates for reforms that gently push the dynasty towards slightly wider marriage networks. Just slightly, baby steps. Her children are born with the unmistakable Habsburg look, features so familiar that midwives murmur to each other, they resemble everyone. Courtiers marvel at the purity of blood. Physicians observe similarities they cannot explain. You step back, watching Magdalena hold her infant child, the future of an impossibly braided lineage. Her face glows with both pride and the faintest shadow of concern. She knows, she understands. She is the culmination of a loop and the beginning of another. But she holds her head high. She navigates her destiny with grace. She bends the spiraling ancestry into something resembling purpose. A woman who was her own great niece. A queen shaped by centuries of ambition. A thread in the Habsburg tapestry not broken, but woven tighter than ever before. You drift onward, and the atmosphere changes, grows heavier, almost mathematical, like you've stepped into the mind of a medieval court genealogist, staring at a chart that looks more like a tangled fishing net than a family tree. Because now you're entering the world of royal women born with triple ancestry, overlap the rare but very real daughters whose bloodlines converged from 3 different directions onto the same ancestors. You're no longer tracing a loop or a spiral. You're tracing a triangle that keeps folding in on itself. Tonight, you meet a young noblewoman named Beata, a princess born into one of the densest dynastic webs in Europe, the kind of lineage that would make even the most confident scribe break out in a medieval sweat. You find her in a quiet tapestry room, sunlight spilling across vibrant scenes of hunts, allegories, saints, and suspiciously dramatic unicorns. Beata is about 12, studying at a carved oak table. Before her sits a massive genealogical scroll, her tutor's idea of a morning lesson. She tilts her head as she examines a cluster of ancestors, appearing once, twice, and yes, 3 times. Her brow furrows, her quill hovers. She mutters, "But how can he be both my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather, and my cousin's grandfather?" The tutor clears his throat nervously. "Well, my lady, your family is thorough. Mainstream fact. Triple-line ancestry overlap happened in several late medieval houses, especially those that combined first-cousin marriages, uncle-niece unions, and re-mergers between cadet branches. It's documented in the Trastamaras, the early Avis Beja lines, and, of course, in certain Habsburg sub-branches. But here's your quirky tidbit. One royal archivist, while diagramming a triple overlap lineage, reportedly wrote, 'I suspect I am drawing circles, not lines,' before scratching out half his chart and starting again. You drift with Beata as she grows into her teenage years, and you notice the strange duality of her world. Everyone praises her pedigree, the priests, the courtiers, the ladies-in-waiting, even ambassadors who normally pretend they know every court's gossip. They call her the perfect union of 3 houses. They call her the child of harmony. They call her blessed with lineage. And yet, whispered behind closed doors, you hear doubts, because Beata's triple overlap means she carries the same ancestral DNA through multiple channels, from her mother's side, from her father's side, and from a third, once-removed branch that looped right back into both. The more you follow her, the clearer it becomes. Beata's life was shaped long before her birth. One afternoon, you drift into a council chamber where her marriage prospects are being discussed. The room is warm, thick with ambition, incense, and the scratch of quills. Advisors stand around a long table covered in maps and family charts that look like someone dropped spaghetti across parchment. The Chancellor clears his throat. "My lords, Lady Beata brings unity from 3 lines. Her marriage must reinforce these bonds. The candidates? All cousins. Naturally, some are first cousins, some are second cousins. One is a cousin by 3 roots, and someone suggests him with actual enthusiasm. You drift onward, and the flames of the torches seem to lean toward you, as if even they sense that you're approaching one of the strangest, tightest genealogical spirals in medieval Europe. Because tonight you step into the life of a princess whose parents were cousins. Twice. Not once. Not in a casual, everyone is everyone's cousin here, medieval way. No, this is a double cousin loop, where both her mother and father were related to each other through 2 separate ancestral lines. It's the kind of family tree that makes you want to take a very long sip of water and whisper, "Oh, absolutely not," while medieval matchmakers cheerfully reply, "Oh, absolutely yes." You find her, let's call her Agnes, in a warm, high-windowed study. She's reading an illuminated manuscript, fingers tracing the gold leaf patterns as though she can feel the history humming beneath her touch. She's about 12, quiet but observant, with that peculiar aura you've noticed among the most genealogically special royals. A calmness bordering on clairvoyance, like she's been born understanding that the world expects something specific and heavy from her. Behind her, pinned to the wall, is a genealogical tapestry. It's beautiful. It's elaborate. It's wrong. Or rather, it's simplified. The real version would require at least 4 more loops and a headache. Agnes's parents, Duke Raymond and Duchess Beatrice, were cousins through their fathers and cousins through their mothers. 2 separate lines. 2 separate sets of shared ancestors. 2 reasons for the church to sigh heavily and reach for the papal dispensation inkpot. Mainstream fact. Double cousin marriages were prized among dynasties desperate for unity and terrified of losing land through marriage dispersal. It allowed 2 branches of a family to fuse inheritance rights without bringing in competing claims. But here's your quirky tidbit. One medieval bishop reportedly said that marrying into the same family twice was like tying a rope with two knots sturdier, but do not pull too hard. A metaphor no one asked for, yet somehow perfect. You drift beside Agnes as she studies that tapestry. She points to one ancestral figure. Her tutor corrects her. She points again. Her tutor hesitates, realizing that, yes, that ancestor does appear twice, and maybe it's best not to dwell on it before lunch. Agnes grows up surrounded by relatives, cousins who are also second cousins, uncles who are also something like great-uncles but not exactly, aunts who introduce themselves using titles that sound like someone spilled alphabet soup. But Agnes moves through it with a serenity beyond her years. And then, one spring morning, everything shifts. A council is gathered. The chamber is solemn, the air buzzing with anticipation. Agnes is summoned. You drift with her as she enters the council hall, her footsteps soft against the polished stone. Her father sits at the head of the table, maps unfurled around him. Her mother sits beside him, composed but clearly anxious. Agnes, her father begins, a marriage has been proposed. Of course it has. This is medieval Europe. Of course it's a cousin. But which cousin? That's the fun part. One of them is related to her through her mother's line, another through her father's line, a third through both lines, just like her parents. And yes, that is exactly the one the council is leaning toward. Historians still argue whether this match was political brilliance or hereditary madness. Some praise it. A secure alliance. Perfect symmetry. Others note it as a cautionary tale of genealogical tightening gone too far. The debate remains deliciously unresolved. Agnes accepts the betrothal with a grace that surprises even her parents. She has been raised to understand duty. But she is also clever, observant, capable of seeing the web for what it is, a pattern she did not choose, but one she can influence from within. Her wedding is a spectacle of glittering silk, carved altars, and choirs booming with celebratory determination. As she stands beside her cousin husband, who shares at least 2 ancestral lines with her, you sense the entire court breathing a sigh of relief. The union has closed the loop. The houses are bound. The inheritance is secured. And Agnes? She steps into queenship with quiet strength. She becomes a skilled mediator, easing tensions between rival branches of the family. She patronizes learning, commissioning translations of medical and philosophical texts. Courtiers praise her diplomacy. Ambassadors admire her composure. The people love her for her generosity. But you also see her private life. Late at night, she sits beside a table, poring over letters from her siblings. She reads about family feuds, border disputes, inheritance crises, all of which her marriage was supposed to fix. She smiles softly, a little sadly, because she realizes something the council never fully understood. You can braid bloodlines together, but you cannot braid human nature. Still, she does her best. When her first child is born, midwives marvel at how familiar the baby looks, like her husband, and like her father, and like her mother, and like her grandmother, and like basically everyone on the tapestry wall. Agnes holds her newborn with fierce tenderness, whispering promises that sound almost like rebellion. You will choose your path, not the tapestry, not the council, you. And in that moment, she becomes more than the product of double cousin ancestry. She becomes a woman shaping destiny in ways her ancestors never imagined. You drift away with the image of Agnes standing at a balcony, wind in her hair, looking down at a kingdom that sees only a queen. But you, the quiet observer, you know she is more. A daughter of 2 branches that became one. A mother of a line that will loop again. A woman who carried the weight of double ancestry with single, unwavering grace. You drift forward into the quietest part of the palace, the place where genealogies stop being diagrams and start becoming destiny. Because now you've reached the final and most astonishing spiral of all. A queen whose family tree forms a perfect loop. Not a branch, not a braid, a circle, a closed circuit of ancestry in which every path leads back to the same cluster of ancestors. And tonight, you meet the woman who lived inside that circle a queen will call Helena, the ultimate culmination of centuries of cousin marriages, niece marriages, double cousin loops, and those famous Habsburg-level spirals that made medieval genealogists pray softly into their inkpots. You find Helena standing before a massive stained glass window, sunlight exploding through rubies and sapphires onto her embroidered gown. Her posture is impeccable, her expression serene. She knows who she is, she knows what she represents, and she knows everyone in the room, staring at her, sees more than a queen. They see a symbol, the human embodiment of dynastic ambition condensed into flesh. Behind her hangs a tapestry depicting her ancestry. At first glance, it looks like any noble genealogy, but when you lean closer, you realize something uncanny. 4 of her great-grandparents are the same 2 people. Her maternal and paternal lines overlap. Her parents were double cousins, their parents were cousins once removed, and the generation before that involves an uncle-niece union. It's not a tree, it's a perfect medieval Ouroboros, a serpent swallowing its own ancestral tail. Mainstream fact: at least one major medieval queen, and several princesses, were born into lineages so insular that they could map every branch of their ancestry back to the same 2 or 4 individuals in fewer than 3 generations. But here's your quirky tidbit. A court philosopher once described Helena's pedigree as so complete that God himself could not add. Another connection. A compliment? A warning? Hard to say. Medieval philosophers loved dramatic flair. You drift beside Helena as she prepares for a council audience. She moves with calm, forceful precision, the kind born not from arrogance, but from lifelong awareness that her identity is already larger than any room she enters. Courtiers bow deeply, ambassadors whisper, advisors watch her face for the slightest indication of which ancestral faction she favors. Because Helena isn't just queen of her kingdom, she is the embodiment of every family line that ever tried to claim the throne. Every branch, every claimant, every legacy, all folded into one woman. Her marriage? Already arranged, of course. Her groom is a cousin again, not surprising. But what is surprising is how complicated his relationship to her is. He is her first cousin on one line, her second cousin on another, and her third cousin on yet another. It's like layering a genealogical cake with the same ingredient 3 different ways. The wedding is a spectacle of shimmering gold and choral thunder. Helena stands beside her cousin husband, serene as always, wearing a crown heavy enough to anchor a ship. But her eyes flicker not with fear, not with rebellion, but with a kind of grim understanding. She wasn't chosen for who she is. She was chosen for what her bloodline represents, a unification centuries in the making. Historians still argue whether women like Helena represented political brilliance or catastrophic inbreeding. Some say these unions forged near unbreakable dynastic legitimacy. Others argue they sowed the seeds of long-term instability. The debate is so intense that one historian famously wrote, "Medieval politics was 90% marriage and 10% consequences." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. You drift through Helena's court life. She negotiates rebellions with a steady hand. She softens the king's harsher instincts. She becomes beloved by her people for her fairness and intelligence. She births children who look unmistakably like every ancestor adorning the palace tapestries. The resemblance is so strong that midwives joke, quietly, they are all little portraits already. But Helena's greatest strength is not her bloodline, it's her mind. Late at night, you find her at a writing desk, candles guttering, parchment spread around her like wings. She studies history, laws, treaties. She writes letters to foreign courts with the finesse of someone who understands her role in a much larger tapestry. And in a small, private journal, never meant to be read by anyone, she writes a line that reveals everything. "I am the end of a circle. Let my children be the beginning of something new." Because Helena understands what her ancestors did not. A dynasty cannot survive on loops alone. It must grow outward, branch, change. She knows her lineage is brilliant, powerful, breathtaking but fragile. She knows her children need more than a perfect loop. They need choices, and so she bends her influence toward a future few around her, can even imagine a future where her children might marry outside the circle, where the dynasty opens instead of tightens, where ancestry becomes strength, not weight. When you drift away, Helena stands on her balcony, wind stirring her dark hair, her gaze sweeping across the kingdom that carries her lineage. She looks serene, but determined. For the first time in centuries, the loop may break not by force, but by wisdom. A queen born from a perfect circle. A queen who chose to draw a line outward. A queen who ended a pattern centuries old. And now, as the torches dim and the last echoes of medieval halls soften into a gentle hush, you find yourself drifting slowly away from crowns, from genealogies, from the tightly woven spirals of bloodlines and destiny. Everything that felt dense